Hey, Phil here from MatchMaker, and in this video I'm going to suggest what I believe to be 31 pretty clever questions to ask on your podcast. Now let's make one thing absolutely clear right away. The best podcast interview questions will never be generic ones like those I'm going to suggest to you shortly. So you will absolutely need to do your research and, carefully tailor your approach to each guest you have on your show because, of course, a genuine flowing conversation about specific topics and relevant questions will always overshadow questions about someone's favourite shade of blue or something like that. What did your parents do for a living? You're probably thinking this is an odd question to ask, but that's exactly the point. If your guest has done plenty of interviews before, they'll be expecting you to kick off by asking something like, could you tell me about your background and what you do? Now, there's nothing wrong with that question in principle, but guests will have answered it countless times before. They'll have a pre-prepared script that they'll launch into in response. Now, by starting your interview asking what their parents did for a living instead, you're shaking things up a little. Guests will have to drop their standard spiel and think on the spot to respond, making them more engaged in the conversation as a result. It sets them up perfectly to tell a story about their childhood and their upbringing. Now, this question might not be right for every guest, but you should try to avoid predictable opening questions when you can. In your own words, what does the phrase mean to you? Your guest's area of expertise is likely a deep source of meaning in their lives. They've devoted countless hours to it. Now, and its influence likely extends into many facets of their life. By asking them what a particular phrase means to them, you're guaranteed to get a unique response. They have to answer by viewing the topic through the lens of their own experiences, their own intuitions and opinions. That's much more interesting than a matter-of-fact description of something. What are you not very good at? Yes, this does sound like a sort of what are your weaknesses job interview type question, but again, your guests will be used to talking about their strengths and areas of expertise. So by asking them about the things that they struggle with, it can keep the conversation fresh and interesting. The response will help paint a more complete and accurate picture of them as a person, making them more relatable for listeners. And who knows, the answer they could give could spark a callback later on, or a running joke, a revealing look into their life. Nobody is brilliant at everything, and it's always nice to be reminded of that. What's your favourite book, your favourite film, your favourite album, and why? Even if your guest is coming onto your podcast to talk about business or current affairs or history even, it's good to still quiz them about their personal interests as well, to explore more about the personality and tastes of the real person underneath. They could be a huge fan of George Orwell's many dystopian worlds, or the many great films of Paul Verhoeven, or maybe they just really like that one Frank Sinatra album where he sings about going to space. It's just a great way of getting the conversation started, a way of easing them in. How did you meet your other half? Obviously, double check that your guest does have a partner before asking this one. And if they do, it's a good opener to include towards the start of your interview. An easy way of immediately helping the listener feel like they know the guest on a much more personal level. Plus, it might also uncover a funny or interesting anecdote, so it definitely has some potential. Who would you like to play you in a movie? Quite a few of us have mentally nominated a specific actor to play us in the Hollywood adaptation of our lives. They might even surprise you and make a rogue choice, perhaps. Just make sure you follow up on it, to really get to the bottom of their decision. Do they look similar? Do they have certain things in common? And if so, what? So what does your morning routine look like? Have you ever seen two people have completely identical morning routines? Well, it's a rare occurrence, and if your guest is a high performer, chances are they have certain morning rituals they perform religiously in an effort to, win the day. What do they make time for that others don't? And why is doing so important to them? It could be squeezing in a 5 a.m. workout, meditating, or, just leaving enough time to whip up their go-to breakfast. What makes you feel inspired or motivated? Inspiration comes in many forms. It's an essential prerequisite to become truly successful at anything, and it often comes from places you absolutely wouldn't expect. So by asking guests what motivates or inspires them, it will reveal what has kept their passion alive over the years. Of course, out of courtesy, be sure to have an answer prepared yourself, as knowing you are both listening and contributing to the question can further spur on the interview and make your guest more comfortable and appreciated. What's one thing that people are generally surprised to find out about you? By asking them if there's something surprising that people aren't already aware of, you're immediately inviting them to tell you something fresh and unique, especially if it causes them to think on their feet. It could be a funny childhood story, an out-of-the-box hobby, or just a peculiar habit. If anything, it could be something that makes your guest more relatable and down to earth. A lot of guests, especially bigger name ones, will tend to get the same questions asked in every interview they do, so they'll probably appreciate the opportunity to share something a little bit out there, something a bit different. If you were going to live on a desert island but could only take one thing with you, what would it be? If you're a fan of BBC Radio 4's Desert Island Discs, you'll be familiar with this type of question. It's an interesting one because what you're really asking is, what's one thing you couldn't live without? And that's something that can prompt literally any answer from your guest. Now, finding out what valuable, sentimental, practical, or even daft items they deem necessary for survival will really shine a new light on how your guest is otherwise perceived, especially if the answer for said item, again, comes with an anecdote. What keeps you up at night? Listen, we all have fears and anxieties we replay over and over in our minds. We can't help it. We can distract ourselves during the day, of course, but those thoughts tend to surface when we're in bed, staring at the ceiling and expressionless, as the rest of the world just slowly rests, blissfully, and recovers, and those hours just gradually crumble away from our grasp. But asking guests this question can often open up interesting discussions. Sometimes about what guests are most worried about is completely removed from their area of expertise. Again, be tactful here, as this question won't be right for every guest. It could be a bit of a loaded question, especially if they come across as being more shy or introverted. What's your biggest fear? From spiders to confined spaces and holes to men with beards, there's certainly a wide array of phobias out there. Even if their fear isn't anything particularly obscure, just getting an idea of what they're not comfortable around can give you and your listeners a good insight into their mindset. If they start profusely sweating, however, then it might be wise to abort your line of questioning and move swiftly on with the next one. Who's your favourite podcaster right now? Even if your guest isn't a podcaster themselves, they've still taken time out of their day to appear on yours. So they must have at least some interest in them. And hey, if you're the first podcaster they've ever been exposed to, then that should instantly make you number one, right? Now, if you ask your guest who their current favourite podcast or host is, they'll give you a name and probably a justification as to why they chose them. Now, their reasoning will likely give you an insight into their personal life or specific interests. Do they like investigative crime journalism? Do they have a god-awful taste in hosts like Joe Rogan? Or are they literally into anyone or anything better? Just dive in and find out. Tell me something you think is true that almost nobody agrees with you on. Now, we're not asking you to sniff out the latest edgelords on the scene, but undeniably, can help you bring it to the forefront in your interviews, perhaps even derailing it to explore it further. Whatever the response is, your guest will likely have deeply entrenched reasons for holding that particular belief, which, again, like some of our previous questions, will show a different side to their personality, perhaps.
Are you looking for a podcast or radio show to appear on? Are you struggling to find a guest for your podcast or radio show? Let me introduce you to MatchMaker.fm. Simply create a profile, narrow your niche, and use the inbuilt messenger to contact potential partners. And the best part, it's free to sign up. So, let's find your match.
If you could have dinner with any three people, dead or alive, who would it be and why? This is a fun question to throw in towards the end of your interviews because, well, it puts guests on the spot and you'll often get some pretty unusual or quirky names. Celebrities, historical figures, scientists, philosophers, whoever they pick will have a rather specific reason attached to them, especially if they're trying to impress you and your listeners. Personally, I'd like to have Norm Macdonald, Rhea Ripley and Keanu Reeves for no other reason than it'd be cool as f***. Who do you look up to the most? They might reply with a certain celebrity, a memorable high school teacher, or just a family member. Or maybe they'll name drop someone completely unexpected. Whoever they choose, make sure you dig deeper and ask them why this particular individual means so much to them. How big is your inner circle? No matter how many acquaintances your guest has, there's likely to be an inner circle of friends that they spend the most time with, and the same circle that they share the most intimate details of their life with. How many people do they consider to be in it? And are they friends from school or people they've met in recent years? Audiences love partaking in a bit of voyeurism, so getting your guest to share some of this behind the scenes type of stuff usually makes for engaging content. What was the last thing you Googled? We've all needed a quick answer at some point, and what better place to go for it than Google? However, weird or wonderful the response you get is, this question is a fun one and can provide some light-hearted relief. There's really no saying what your guest's answer will be, which is exactly what you want. The more outlandish, the better, so make sure that there's no judgment or embarrassment necessary at all. If you could turn back time and talk to your 18-year-old self, what would you tell them? Hindsight is 20/20. We could all save ourselves a lot of trouble if we could go back and give our former selves some precedent advice, but this is a fun question again to answer, and you'll often hear some pretty unexpected things from your guests, whether it's a warning to steer clear of potential disasters on the horizon, a reminder to relax and not take things so seriously. Guests will often unearth some pearls of wisdom with this sort of question, pearls that could prove useful to all of your listeners. You know, some inspirational content for your inspirational podcast. What was your first job? There's nothing like reminiscing about good old times with somebody. Quizzing your guest about their first job will probably evoke some fond memories or experiences from their younger years. It really doesn't matter where they've worked in the past, as it's a very relatable topic. And it actually really doesn't matter where they've worked in the past, as it's just a very relatable topic to share. And you never know, they may be connecting with someone in a similar position. What one piece of advice would you give to someone just starting out? Retrospect is a wonderful thing, especially when it comes to giving out career advice. As mentioned previously, your guests will have dedicated a lot of time to their specific field, so they're likely to be very passionate about their experiences, regrets, and triumphs. Now, it's important to know your listeners' intent too. So if you know they're looking for advice, it's a great question to ask, as your show could be the catalyst that helps get them there, whether they want to be or not. How would your parents describe what you do? Have you ever struggled to communicate what you do for a living with your parents? You're certainly not alone, as you're currently staring at a radio helper, and chances are your guest has had a similar experience at some point. So asking them about it has potential for a good story. Now, this won't be an appropriate question for every guest, of course, like if they're a gardener, because what they do is obvious. So try to save this one for guests with unusual jobs like paper towel sniffing, snake milking, or dog surfing instructor. Real jobs that exist. What's been the most memorable moment of your career so far? If you think back on your career to date, there's probably one moment that sticks out more than others. I mean, it's the same for your guest, and asking them to define it can make for a really good story. And it might not be what you're expecting them to say either. Perhaps they've recently won a prestigious award in their field, and you'd figure that that'd be the response. But in actual fact, it's that time they worked with a certain person, which was a bigger milestone for them. Adding in this question can help you and your audience get an idea of what truly matters to your guest and what they value most, and of course, what they're most proud of. If you could give one piece of advice to your previous boss, what would it be? We've all dreamt about this one at some point or another. Giving that previous employer a good old 1-2 of perspective and guidance. Here, we obviously wouldn't recommend slating or targeting certain people, but it's definitely a question with potential for an entertaining response. And whether your guest had a good or bad relationship with their former boss, you'll be giving them an opportunity to say something they may not have had the chance to say anywhere else. And it's certainly a unique question at the very least. What do you hope the world will look like in 10 years? Quite the broad, difficult to answer question, sure, but quizzing your guest about their utopian fantasy is bound to spark a unique response. We all have different ideals, especially when it comes to society, after all. Now, will they be championing world peace, or wishing for flying cars, or something a bit more problematic? I mean, obviously, we wouldn't recommend probing a blatantly outrageous response and angering anyone, but contrarian views do tend to make more compelling content, so, keep that in mind. Would you rather have more time or more money? A response will give you a good insight into what they value in life and what they deem to be more worthwhile. Of course, if anyone responds saying more money isn't important to them, then at least you and your audience can write them off for being a blatant liar. I kid, of course. Kind of. But it'd still be good to ask them what their reasoning is. Maybe they struggled financially growing up. Maybe they already do have an unlimited supply of money. Or maybe they lost a loved one early on and recognize the importance of staying connected to family. It can certainly help install some integrity within your show and on your guest. Have you had your "I've made it" moment yet? I mean, of course, that specific moment is subjective to everyone. else would. Dropping this one in can help you get a good idea of where their head's at, and it could even lead your conversation down a more philosophical route regarding to the right things to value in life. What are you looking forward to in the future, both personally or professionally? This could be anything, and it doesn't necessarily need to be connected to their career. Maybe they're excited to reach a certain milestone, get married, or visit a country they've always dreamt of seeing. Humans tend to focus a lot of time and energy on past experiences and regrets. So this question might prompt your guest to project their mind into the future, and that results in unique, fresh conversation. How do you want to be remembered? This is quite a big question, and it might take your guest by surprise slightly, or even instill a little uncertainty or nervousness even. Now that's not a bad thing though, because it means you'll get an unrehearsed answer, which is what you want. Asking this question is bound to provoke some deep thinking from your guest, as you're essentially asking them what legacy they want to leave behind. Again, this doesn't have to strictly relate to their career, as it's a very personal question begging for a very personal response. So make sure to listen and follow up with whatever they say. Asking real questions can add vulnerability to your guest and your content, which of course, again, makes it more engaging. What should I have asked but didn't? Similarly to that old job interview question of, is there anything you wanted to ask me? This is a great way to wrap up your interviews, because your guest might have been keen to touch on a topic you left out of your other questions. So asking this simple question at the end gives them a window to talk about it, particularly if that window is slowly closing due to the length of this episode. Now, some guests spend time preparing in advance of interviews, and they may have a few last-minute gems they can share with your audience, like touching on events or shows they'll be attending, books they're reading, or charities they're working with. Often your guests will let you know you've already covered the important stuff, but it's always good to double-check because, well, it's polite, isn't it? Where can people go to find out more about you and your work? Now, most guests typically do podcast interviews for a reason. You know, they might have released a new book, they're hosting an event, or they may be the founder of a startup gaining traction in the press. Whatever it is, they're giving up their time to speak with you to help spread the word about something. So it's only fair you give them an opportunity to plug whatever they'd like during that conversation. Asking this question at the end of every interview is a good way to close. If they mention any specific websites or social media handles, you should include those in your episode descriptions and show notes so listeners can find them easily. Remember, guests will be far more likely to share the episode and help promote your podcast if you give them the opportunity to plug what they'd like. Well, there we have it. 31 pretty generic yet fascinating inviting questions to ask your guests on your next podcast. And if you're ready to try out asking said questions, then book your next guest today using MatchMaker. Next podcasters with great guests, and it's completely free to begin using. Now, if you'd like to check out the original article that this video was based on, as well as many other riveting and incredibly useful articles about broadcasting, then head to our blog via amplify.matchmaker.fm. Take care, and I'll probably see you soon.